Welcome to Season 3 of Locker Room for Growth, a show with human centric conversations that include compelling stories, unique professions, and those who set the tone for living with a positive attitude. I'm your host, Debbie Elicksen. Please subscribe to the show and check out our past episodes and clips. Follow me on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Threads, and more. Now let's meet our next guest.
They may call European football or soccer the beautiful game, but in America, the sport that owns that title in soul and spirit is baseball. Anyone who has ever attended a game in person, whether it was AA, AAA, or professional, every experience has one thing in common: atmosphere. Ken Smoller has spent a lifetime capturing the sights and smells of over 2,350 stadiums in 48 states and 24 countries. But it is Chicago and Comiskey Park that holds a special place in his heart. Not because it's his home, where he grew up a White Sox fan, but the history, the character, the romance of a place where baseball has lived its greatest and darkest moments in time. A photographer, writer, and founder of the sports travel website Stadium Vagabond, Smoller has a law degree from the University of Pennsylvania and serves as general counsel for a major real estate developer in New England. While he may live in Massachusetts, the spirit of Chicagoland and Comiskey Park has called upon him to chronicle the imagery for the documentary The Last Comiskey about the final 1990 season of the original stadium, which was written, directed, and produced by Matt Flesch. Smoller has subsequently published a book capturing these iconic images as a love letter to this baseball legacy and the White Sox franchise. Smoller's mantra, and through his images, is that the best way to understand culture and fabric of a place is through its sporting arenas and stadiums. Please welcome Ken Smoller.
Thanks so much for having me, Debbie. Great to talk to you.
There are families and generations of members who have taken turns as hot dog vendors, selling programs and hanging out at the stadium. What are your first memories of Comiskey Park?
My first memories, and it was great that you mentioned the smells, because my first memories actually somewhat relate to that. I first went to a White Sox game in 1977 when I was probably about 6 years old. And the thing that hit me first were the sights and the sounds of that particular ballpark. When a home run was hit, the scoreboard would explode. You would smell that sulfur coming out, and it would sort of resonate and linger in the ballpark for a while. There was then the sounds of Nancy Faust, the great organist who played for 41 years for the White Sox, singing or playing Na 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 Hey Hey Goodbye with all the fans singing along. There was a smell to the old ballparks. You know, it was 80 years of beer, hot dogs, grilled onions, and fresh popcorn that you got to sense. And whenever I talk to people about that old ballpark, one of the things they always bring up is the smell. You don't get that in the modern concrete ballparks, but that was something that stuck with me from early on. When I was a kid, I cared more that the White Sox hit a home run and could experience that moment where it all came together than I did probably about a win. And there weren't that many wins in those days. So you had to find your happiness in other ways. And that was to some degree what Bill Veeck, then owner, tried to do with the ballpark, is create happiness for fans regardless of the outcome.
Yeah, it's true, because baseball is a long game. Like when you're there, I mean, there's not a whole lot of action like in hockey and football.
Yeah.
So you are, in between pitches, in between batters, and if they change the pitcher, you've got this downtime. So being a broadcaster is one thing, but particularly the minor league ballparks, the atmosphere, making things fun, having activities for the kids and contests and whatever, those are part of the fabric of what makes up some of those minor league teams.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I grew up,
So it's
those didn't
marketing
exist yet.
101, right?
Yeah. And that was Bill Veeck. He was the forerunner of that. When I grew up, they didn't have that at Old Comiskey Park necessarily. There were no outfield play areas. Instead, what happened was I would take my little 110 camera, my little Kodak 110 camera, would roam around and take pictures. And as soon as I was old enough for my parents to let me leave my seat and explore, that's what I did every game. I would go try to get different angles from the corners of the ballpark and explore the ramps in the outfield. And, I really didn't have the technology or the know-how to take pictures of players in those days, but I could get those wide angle shots and really kind of
Mm.
remember and treasure my memories. And that has been the outgrowth since then. I kept on doing that. From what I started doing when I was probably about 11 or 12, I still do it today. Every time I go to a new ballpark, I rarely sit in my seat. I explore all the different parts of a ballpark. I love seeing how each of them are different, whether there's a kids play area or a special food that they use that's, reminiscent of that city. That's something I love. Certain musical notes that they play, songs they play, because that is part of the culture of that city. That's kind of how I feel that a stadium really reflects what the culture is of a particular place. You learn a lot about what those folks are like in that city based on how is their stadium set up, who goes there. You see young, old, all different ethnicities, rich, poor. You get to really understand a place, and yeah, that's been part of my experience always, and one of the reasons I fell in love with Comiskey growing up.
And you, even though you were a photo editor at the Michigan Daily in the early 1990s, the law profession beckoned you. And I have to ask, why real estate?
Yeah, well, it kind of ties together in a lot of ways
Yeah, I
because
guess.
the old ballparks were always in cities, and I loved urban history and architecture. And when I was deciding, listen, if I'm a photographer for life, I may not make a lot of money. Um,
We all
all
need a
my
side gig.
yeah, my brethren at the time on the newspaper, the ones who had graduated and became professional photographers, they were all broke. And it's a tough life. Sometimes, you know what? Go legit, go straight, get a good degree, make some money, and then do this on the side. But real estate was something that was interesting to me because of my love of stadiums. That's a major part and has since then become part of urban development. Starting with what the great Janet Marie Smith, the architect behind Camden Yards, did. It incorporated a city and a ballpark together and made them kind of work in concert with one another. And to this day, that's been part of what ballpark development is. It rarely is just the development of a ballpark. It's the development of mixed use housing nearby, shops, restaurants, hotels, water features, etc. And in many ways, that's what they're trying to do now with this newly discussed ballpark in the South Loop of Chicago that would replace Comiskey 2, New Comiskey. It
Already?
would be 30 years.
Yeah.
It's if you look back now on the life cycle, a lot of ballparks and stadiums have only lasted about 30 to 40 years.
Yeah.
We've already lost two from that generation, one in Texas, which has been converted to football, and then another in Atlanta converted to football. The Braves moved suburban and the Texas Rangers moved across the street. So a lot of White Sox fans that I've talked to are kind of ready for a new ballpark. No one really ever loved New Comiskey for a variety of reasons. And they'd love to instead get something that evokes a little bit more pride like what Old Comiskey did. And the preliminary designs of the new ballpark excite both the baseball fan in me and the real estate lawyer in me, because I can see how it would be great for the city, great for development, great for business, but great for fans as well. And it's an exciting concept that I think would be great for the city.
And you, even when you were in college, you went back home and as a vendor at Comiskey Park and
Yeah.
Soldier Field. Were you in a position to see games or see part of games, or were you kind of regulated to the concourse?
It was kind of, well, when you're vending, everything you make is how much you sell. And you get competitive. The vendors are competitive with each other. Who sold the most in my age group? Because it was based on seniority, what item you got. And so you actually spend the whole day looking at the fans, and you get to see who are the fans. So I also did Wrigley Field, and you can see how the White Sox fans differ from the Cubs fans. I will say the White Sox fans tipped better and obviously bought a lot more beer, as they've been sort of known over the years as being
You got to drown your
the beer
sorrows
drinking.
somehow.
Yeah. Old Comiskey used to be called the world's largest outdoor saloon. And New Comiskey maybe wasn't exactly the same, but you got to see those fans. The one thing about New Comiskey, or Old Comiskey as well, that you got was you knew when a home run was hit, everyone would turn around to watch the fireworks. No one was going to buy my beer, hot dog, peanuts, whatever. So I would always turn around and watch the fireworks and see kind of what happened. But you really didn't get to watch the game, not because of what they told us to do, but just because you wanted to hustle and make some money.
Yeah.
My goal at the time was to make just enough money so I'd have the ability to travel and do a summer trip and go see some other ballparks through the summer by the end of the year, or during the football season, go see various Big Ten games that I wasn't covering, or travel back to go see a Bear game. So that was always my goal. But it was amazing to go and spend every day at the ballpark and just be amongst the fans in that atmosphere. It was also the best shape I've ever been in. Climbing up those upper decks. That's a pretty good stairmaster that you get, just sort of part of your daily routine.
And I have to ask you, the dynamics between Sox fans and Cubs allegiances, I imagine, are pretty fierce. And do the White Sox get as much respect as, say, the Cubs? And also, did you cheer for the Cubs in 2016 during the World Series?
No. I cheered against them. My dad grew up a Sox fan, and it's interesting because he grew up in the way north side in West Rogers Park, and I grew up in the northwest suburbs of Arlington Heights. But I was raised a Sox fan. I was one of very few in my school, and Sox fans have a huge chip on their shoulder, partially because they don't get the attention. When I was growing up, the Chicago Tribune owned the Cubs. They owned the biggest radio station, biggest newspaper, and then a super station broadcasting the Cubs all throughout the country. I don't know if you got them up in Canada at the time. And the White Sox at the time were on pay TV. So they were the stepchild. They were the forgotten team. Sox fans will not let anyone in the national media forget that there was almost no attention paid to them when they broke their curse in 2005 compared to the Red Sox in 2004 or the Cubs in 2016. In fact, ESPN frequently forgets to include them in their graphics. Every Sox fan will tell you that. They did not make the cover of Sports Illustrated. They used to be, when I was growing up, a White Sox win would get relegated to page 2 or 3 of the newspaper, and a Cubs loss would be on page 1. So us Sox fans having such a chip on our shoulder that for 11 glorious years, we had the upper hand between the 2005 World Series and 2016. And as much as Cleveland is a rival of the White Sox, I would guess 95% of White Sox fans rooted aggressively for them in 2016. There's a Schadenfreude, and it's almost like an English soccer thing or a Big Ten football. You don't root for your enemy; you root for their pain.
Yeah.
And that's part of being a White Sox fan, having animosity towards the Cubs, and sadly, Cubs don't really care about the White Sox fans because they know they have the upper hand. So there's a real inferiority complex embedded in White Sox fandom. And that is with respect to the ballpark, the old ballpark, the new ballpark, and everything else about being a Sox fan. So it's why I have a soft spot for the second team in cities, whether it's the New York Mets or Everton and compared to Liverpool and football in England, or the Canadians compared to, I'm sorry, the Leafs compared to the Canadians, as I'm sure, you know,
Well, they're not
hockey
in the
fans can
same
relate.
city, but
Not in the same city, but definitely played the second fiddle.
well, you can't be
So,
a Habs fan if you're a Bruins fan.
and you
There's
can't
that.
be a Cubs fan if you're a White Sox fan.
Yeah.
So the other interesting thing is, my dad grew up a Chicago Cardinals football fan. Actually, that's what my shirt is today. It's Chicago Cardinals, who played more games in Comiskey Park than in any other stadium that they've played in.
Huh.
And at the time, you were a Sox fan and a Cardinals fan and a Cubs fan and or a Cubs fan and a Bears fan. And when the Cardinals moved to St. Louis in 1960, I believe it was, my dad had no choice but to adopt the Bears at that time. So I wonder what would have happened with Sox fans had they actually followed through on their threat to move to Tampa in 1988, and what would have happened to my fandom had they not been the Chicago White Sox, but the Florida White Sox. I don't know what it would have done.
That doesn't sound right.
Yeah, it's exactly. And they were slated, they had printed the shirts, they were slated to be the Florida White Sox playing in the same cursed dome that the Rays play in now.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of what ifs.
Yeah, we won't talk about the Montreal Expos. That's still a sore spot in
I
Canada.
can relate. I can relate. That was the White Sox Expos World Series that was going to happen in '94.
Yeah.
And those poor Expos fans really got of jobbed out of their team with baseball's machinations. And listen, as someone who also loves sports mascots, Youppi was one of the best. He was homeless for a few years until the Habs took him in, and he became their mascot. So
let's talk. Speaking of mascots, in a way, who is Andy the Clown?
Andy the Clown. Andy Radzinski. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. He appeared unpaid, unauthorized for decades as the mascot at Old Comiskey Park. He was both loved and dreaded because what he did is he had this glowing red nose, white face, polka dotted red head to toe clown outfit. And he would roam around the ballpark and get the fans to cheer, "Come on, you White Sox." But it went a lot longer and a lot louder. And it drove some fans crazy. And the ownership tried to get rid of him. And there's a great story that Tom Scher, who was a sportscaster for decades in Chicago and also was the editor for this book, he tells in the documentary a story how Andy went in to try to went into the office of Eddie Einhorn, one of the owners, who was trying to finesse Andy to kind of go into retirement. And instead, he got some sort of extra pay out of the team and a bit of a raise, because at that point he was getting a little bit of a stipend from the team rather than being pushed out. Sadly, in the last year of Old Comiskey Park, they made it clear to Andy he was not invited to the new park other than as a fan. He showed up occasionally. I remember wearing like a leather jacket and no face paint, but the red nose and the hat, and tried to get his routine going. And it didn't play for very long in the new ballpark, but he was a key part of the old ballpark. The old ballpark was filled with characters, whether it was the shoe shine guy on the third base concourse, or, as I mentioned before, the great Nancy Faust, the organist. Harry Carey, for years before he went over to Wrigley, was the White Sox fans' most favorite person throughout the experience. He started the "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" singing along tradition at White Sox games, not at Wrigley Field. And that was something that is another aspect of White Sox fandom that they're bitter about, that he gets associated with Cubs, the Cubs world and their experience. And he really got that started at Comiskey. But Andy was one of those great ones. I'm not so sure Ribby and Rhubarb, the mascots that were the official ones, were ever beloved. They were there for about 6 or 7 years. And photos of both of them are included in the book. Ribby, Rhubarb, Andy the Clown, the shoe shine guy, and of course, Nancy Faust. That's what I loved about the park, was exploring and seeing the characters. You saw the same folks every game.
when I was with the Trappers, we had Max Patkin went on a tour
Sure,
of
sure.
AAA baseball fields, and so
Yeah.
he came
He
to. So I got to meet him there, and he's like, did
Andy
his
the Clown was an outgrowth. I mean, we forget sort of the baseball clown was a thing for
yeah,
decades during the barnstorming eras and before there were fuzzy mascots. And I don't know if anyone predated the San Diego Chicken,
oh
but
yeah,
there were before the fuzzy mascots there were clowns, and they would go to the ballparks and stand on the dugout and do crazy dances and have light up noses and would mimic the umpires derisively. That was part of baseball back in those days. That was before, little kids started to have the fear of clowns that probably
yeah.
accompanied a lot of 80s horror movies. I don't know if that would play
Maybe there's a correlation there.
could be, could be. I don't know if in this day and age you could get a clown in a ballpark
You do
successfully.
that the rodeo though; they're pretty
That's true.
essential at the
That is
rodeo.
true. That is true. And you live near one of the better ones, so
Yes, and they're actually pretty essential there because they help distract the
yeah,
bull while
yeah.
they can get the rider out of the arena.
Yeah, I wonder, but Andy the Clown was quite the character. I got to meet him a handful of times and always a nice guy. I think I had his autograph when I was a little kid.
It's an art to be able to describe these sights and sounds and smells because I mean, sitting here thinking about it, I can try and write it out, but it's doesn't do it justice and in print. So in photographs, what do you look for to capture that moment, to capture those pictures that try and bring the viewer into that stadium?
Yeah, it's almost like what we talked about with vending before. You're not photographing the action per se. Listen, they're professional photographers who are in the wells with long lenses. I always approach it from a fan perspective. Every now and then I got a press pass. And so what you try to do is capture the parts of the park that show the experience that's not what you would see on TV. TV, most of baseball is that one box of home plate, the pitcher, and the batter. Probably 95% of the baseball telecast is that. And I like to swing my camera around, get the wide angles, get the scoreboard, the mascots. My wife encouraged me when I did a trip to Japan for baseball to take photos of the food. And so now that's something I like to do. I try to find the distinctive and interesting food at any game that's unique to that city because it represents that city. Out of respect for fans, I don't typically take photos of fans per se, but big groups or the wave going on or any sort of organized fan displays that they do, which is really big in soccer. They're called tifos. So I try to do that, but I try to tell my stories both with my blog and also the book, both using my words along with photos, because I feel that neither can completely tell the story.
Mm.
And I write this in the book. I'm the annoying guy who's like at a party and says, "Hey, look at this photo. I can't, look at this so I can complete my story." And that's what I'm doing in this book. It's text heavy, but it's photo heavy. There are over 400 photographs in there.
Mm.
But I also talk a lot about like, what did those photos mean? What's being shown in that photo? For example, there's this outfield wall with these beautiful arches that were along the right field side along the Dan Ryan Expressway, where you look at that and you see the beautiful arches. But one thing that I remember is my dad, every time he took me there, would say, when Grandpa took us, the same parking lot guy was there. Every game he told me that story. And that tells the story of the continuation of generations in baseball and the continuity of the ballparks. Comiskey was known as a ballpark that had people that they would work there, their kids would work there, their grandkids would work there, whether it was as a vendor or a program person or someone in the usher group. That's something that Ozzie Guillen spoke to me about when we were preparing for the forward, that he would see the same folks every time. He got to know them. They would say, "Hi, Ozzie, how's the family?" And you don't get that with the modern ballparks the same way, because now all the arenas and stadiums have a separate level that is the service level, where the players come in, the vendors may get their food and whatnot. There's not the same interaction amongst the fans as the old
No.
days, when to get to the locker room from the parking lot, you had to go through the concourse. And so if you
Yeah.
had a bad game, you better hope those fans got out of there quickly. Otherwise, you'd have to face them. And Chicago fans were not always easy,
No.
nor
They were.
necessarily sober at the end of the game.
I remember that
So
from
that was part of the
Swiss hockey.
experience. Yeah. So you really, going back to your original question, I find that this book and my writing, I try to use both photos and my words to paint a picture, to give people a sense as to what it's like to be there, whether it's the Field of Dreams game in Iowa, or a baseball game in Mexico City, or a soccer game in Milan. Not everyone wants to travel or gets to travel. I've been lucky enough that I've kind of constructed my free time so that I'm able to do so. And I try to bring those stories to my readers. Some like to look at the photos, some read my text, some do both. And I like to share those photos with fans and bring back old memories for them of stadiums long gone, or players long gone, or clowns long gone. Sadly, we lost Andy the Clown in the 90s, I believe.
Mm.
Um, and those are stories I like to tell. And I don't think there are a lot of other books or writers that necessarily combine the two that way.
Yeah.
And that's my wheelhouse of how I like to do it.
And these sporting venues are basically cathedrals for so many people. How did Comiskey Park stack up against some of the other iconic fields, and particularly
Yeah.
Wrigley Park?
It's interesting to say cathedral, because the original architect was Zachary Taylor Davis, whose main bread and butter of his business before doing Comiskey Park was doing churches.
Mm.
And so you would see, if you look closely in the facade of old Comiskey, flourishes that he put in there that were somewhat analogous to what you would see at a church of that era. Projections from the facade. Most notably, there were arches throughout the ballpark that evoke in the Roman Colosseum. And I have photos that compare the two, where you could see out of the ballpark into the neighborhood and vice versa. And that was something that was really distinctive, that I've only seen a couple of other venues like that. Yale Baseball Field is one. Ravens Field is one that's like that, where they still have the arches. But of its contemporaries, I thought Comiskey Park was one of the better ones. That, along with Tiger Stadium, which I got to see, they were very similar. They were twin decks that went all the way around the park. It trapped the noise. It gave you great vantage points. It made you feel like you were at the Coliseum in a way. It was something special. The sound was trapped, and it was loud, even when there were only 5,000 fans on a cold September night.
And more
You
intimate.
had that feeling. Yeah, it felt that way. You could hear the players yelling at each other or the umps, and vice versa. And you don't get that with new parks, because instead of having pillars, which did block a lot of seats at the old parks, they have pillars underneath, the concrete supports underneath the upper decks, pushing them up, along with 1, 2, 3, 4 levels of skyboxes and club seats, etc., that also push the fans up and further away. And so you didn't get the same effect.
Yeah.
I love Wrigley Field. It's a great park. I think that they've destroyed it with what they've done in the last 10 years. Leave that aside for what actually is going to be my second book. But there was something special about Comiskey. It had that feeling like you almost felt like it was going back in time, because of, and even before 1910 when it was built, because it did have those arches that looked like the facade of the Roman Colosseum. And it compared favorably in a lot of ways, similar to the old hockey and basketball arenas that we've lost in the last 20 years. In Toronto, Chicago, Boston, Montreal, Detroit. Those places were special, where you were on top of the action. And that's something I really miss with the new parks.
Let's talk about some historic moments. Your favorite photograph is the White Sox celebrating their 2005 World Series in Houston.
Yeah.
Capture that.
Yeah, my favorite sports photograph, I have to say, obviously the photos of my children being born. Number one, are they listening? But I, as a White Sox fan, growing up in the Northwest suburbs, never really developed a friendship with other Sox fans. All my friends were Cubs fans. So when the White Sox went to the World Series,
Awkward.
yeah. When the White Sox went to the World Series, I took my father to game one in Chicago. That was a real treat to be able to do that. And then game four, I told my wife and my boss at the time, I got to go. Like, I have to be there. And I bought a ticket from probably a frustrated Astros fan who sold it because the Sox were up 3-0. And I don't even know where my seat was slated to be. I got real lucky. I snuck down low to take some photos before the game of the pregame ceremonies. They had a tribute to Latin American ball players, and all the stars were there of Latin American baseball history at the time. And I was sitting next to some guys who work for the Chicago TV station just by happenstance. And they said, "Hey, I think you can sit here. No one's going to use this seat." So I sat the whole game, not in my seat, but between home plate and first base,
Oh, wow.
and took photos. I was scared to leave my seat because I was worried I wouldn't get back. So I didn't have any food, drink, bathroom breaks, anything. I did not want to miss it. It was a 1-0 win. And when the Sox were about to clinch it, I slid over behind, away from that mesh fence. At the time was only behind home plate. Now it's the whole foul line for most ballparks. And I just quieted my mind and tried to take a photo and not cheer, even though I was
That's
tickled
hard.
inside. But as the member of the media, and I learned this in college at the Michigan Daily, you
True.
need to stay stoic and focused, and you're not supposed to cheer. And I tried to muster all that and capture that one photo I've been dying to do all my life. And when they were celebrating on the mound, I remember I took so many photos so fast that it kind of builds up in an older digital camera, and it doesn't it freezes. You can't take photos for a second. I was so worried that I didn't get it. And I luckily got about 3 good photos of them celebrating. I think I was framed 5 times in my home. And that was the photo that I felt like all my life I was training myself to take. Because I didn't know if they were ever going to do it. It had been 88 years since they had previously done it. There was barely any radio then. There was no TV, no color film. And who knows when it's going to happen again. And I just wanted to make sure that I had that one photograph. And it was a real treat because there were about maybe 2,000 White Sox fans on hand. We all congregated around the dugout. Other folks were like me. They were alone. And the Sox came out and they sprayed us with champagne and included us in their celebration.
Oh.
And it was such a special moment. I got a lot of photos of Ozzie Guillen celebrating with his family, who were all, part of the experience with him. They were young 20-somethings at the time. And I had shared some of those photos with Ozzie's kids maybe about 3 years ago. And that's what led to the conversation where I got to meet Ozzie and convince him to do the forward for the book, was through that experience and those great World Series photos that I was able to share with him. But, nothing like that, to see your team finally win a championship and be able to photograph it.
That's awesome. And of course, I would be remiss not to comment about Ron Kittle, who before my time played AAA in Edmonton.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And he won the MVP in 1982 with the Pacific Coast League. So,
yeah. And then he went on to win.
Bring that up because he was a major part.
He was a great hitter. He came up and in 1983 was the Rookie of the Year in the American League, was an all-star, broke the White Sox rookie record for home runs, and he was a local kid. He had worked, I think his father was a steel guy from Gary, Indiana. I think he had done that some of his summers as well. He is actually, to my great delight, going to be at our book launch event in Chicago in May.
Oh, cool.
He and Jack McDowell, 93 AL Cy Young, and Don Paul, who lived every kid's dream. He's a Chicago suburban guy, grew up a Sox fan, and got to pitch for them. So those 3 are going to be on hand we have a big event, a free event at the Chicago History Museum in May, on May 16th. It's all available on the book website, lastcomiskeybook.com. But Ron Kittle, I'm so excited for him to be there. He did something that very few players did. He hit multiple home runs on the roof of the upper deck of Old Comiskey Park in left field. I think only about 30 people ever did that, including Babe Ruth, including Jimmy Fox of the old Oakland Athletics. But he hit a whole bunch of them starting with his first year, and had 3 different stints for the White Sox, and was a treasured player among Sox fans. Still to this day, he's really big in the community. But I forgot he did start as a trapper.
Yes, he did. Yes, he
Yeah.
did. Yeah, it was before my time, and he was long gone by the time I got there. But yeah,
Yeah, he hit towering
his
home
legacy
runs.
lived on, right?
Yeah, towering home runs, and that was about 10 years before players started to chemically enhance themselves. So it was
Yes.
all with his strength, and he was an old school kind of retro kind of guy.
I do know a couple guys
At
that
83,
didn't necessarily test negative.
But yeah, he was one of the great ones. He was one of the great ones.
And okay, now we'll go to the dark side. Carlton Fisk. And that had to be in the ultimate betrayal, eh? Yeah, going into the Hall of Fame as a Cub.
Red Sox is a Red Sox. He said for all of his years in Chicago, he's going to go in as a White Sox. He had left somewhat acrimoniously from Boston. He was one of the earliest free agents. They messed up the paperwork, and he became a free agent in 81. And he came over and graced Sox fans with his presence for 13 years. And he left a little acrimoniously from the White Sox as well. And the Red Sox reached out to him. And I actually have a photo that I took. I decided not to include this one in the book, of me at the Hall of Fame covering up the logo on his Red Sox hat. It's funny that you say that. I was actually at Fenway, where I live now in Boston, 2 miles from Fenway Park. I was there when he had his number retired by the Red Sox. And I think I told everyone around me, I did it, but I told everyone around me, he said he's going in the Hall of Fame as a White Sox. He said he's going in. And sure enough, he announced he's going in as a Red Sox. And they retired his number at both places. And I think he's made up at the White Sox. But yeah, he was my childhood hero. He was one of the first stars. Yeah, it was. I met him when I had a press pass for one day in the final season of Old Comiskey. I used my Michigan Daily clout. I use that term with big quotes to get a press pass to cover the Sox, ostensibly because the California Angels pitcher went to Michigan. His name was Jim Abbott. He had one arm. If you remember, he had one arm. He also had threw a no-hitter later for the Yankees. So based on the fact that he was a Michigan alum, I got a press pass, and tried to interview Carlton Fisk in the locker room afterwards. It was a real rough loss. He was walking around in his underwear, and I asked him if he would share a few thoughts about Old Comiskey Park with me. He was not in the mood to talk that day.
Yeah.
And I later learned from one of his assistant GMs at the time that if they lost, he took it so hard he was not going to talk to press unless he had to.
That's like all athletes, though.
Yeah. But he now that I've lived in New England for 20 plus years, he's a New Hampshire guy. I got a little sense of the personality, the stoicism of New Hampshireites, and I kind of understand it. It didn't necessarily meld well with me being this bright-eyed young college photographer from Chicago. Yeah. But that was my one brush with Pudge Fisk. Seeing him in his underwear and having him refuse my interview request. So,
hey,
got some great photos of him though. Yeah,
you are not alone.
I have some wonderful photos of him in the book from the time that I started taking pictures in 1982 until he left the team in 93. He was someone who was a no nonsense kind of player, and Sox fans respected his hard work. Mm-hmm. But me as a little friendly photographer with my big smile, he wasn't buying it.
No.
So,
what's next? You mentioned the Wrigley Field.
Yeah, my next project that I'm going to work on. I've got to see how well this book does, and if it can justify my publisher doing another book. But I'd love to do a book about all the old Chicago stadiums.
Hmm.
old Chicago Stadium, old Soldier Field, old Wrigley Field before the renovations, and all the stadiums really around Illinois at the college, collegiate level, every sport. I have photographed them. I probably have hundreds of thousands of photos of the Chicago stadiums and the athletes over the last 4 decades. And they don't do any good sitting there gathering dust as
That would
negatives
be
in
a
my
great book,
storage.
I think.
Yeah, I'd love to appeal to all Chicago fans, but not just that.
Particularly if you include a college football and
Exactly,
anything college,
exactly.
right?
I've been traveling all around the state every time I go there to make sure I've got all the colleges represented because college sports are a big deal in the Midwest.
Mhm.
And the University of Illinois in particular is a home team for Chicagoans in a lot of ways, even the
Well,
folks that didn't go there.
basketball too is,
It's a great venue. It's one of the
yeah,
most beautiful, iconic arenas. It was built in 1963, Assembly Hall was its original name, and now it's a corporate name. And it looked like a spaceship at the time. It was really modern and still looks modern to this day. My dad always likes to remind me he graduated in there in his first year in 63.
and didn't Caitlin just get drafted to Illinois?
Yeah. No. She's going to Indiana.
Oh,
Um,
Indiana, sorry.
Angel
Hi.
Reese. Angel Reese is gonna grace Wintrust Arena, the shared with DePaul.
Right.
They had a huge boost in season ticket sales after their draft last week.
Yeah.
I think that city is going to really embrace the Chicago Sky. They won a championship a few years ago, and they packed that place. And that's the thing, when teams win, there's a lot of loyalty. The Chicago Sting soccer team won in 1981 and 1984, breaking at that time an 18-year streak of no championships for the team. And the city threw a parade. They won, unfortunately, on the road at a neutral site in Toronto, and not at Comiskey Park where they played most of their games, along with Wrigley Field. But so that's going to be my next book, is to talk about all those stories of the Chicago sports venues that are still with us, no longer with us. Maybe just have a plaque. The West Side grounds where the Cubs played before Wrigley Field, there's a plaque. It's part of the University of Illinois Chicago hospital system. There are a lot of different sort of ghosts of the old ballparks and stadiums in Chicago. And then I'd like to go on and do it for Boston and New York and Philly and Toronto and a lot of other cities where I maybe don't have the same depth of photos, but
Yeah.
I have enough that can, I think, make a really entertaining book for folks.
If you can fit in one on somewhere around in Edmonton, especially hockey, that thing will sell out.
Yeah, I certainly got all the modern Edmonton stadia.
Because I'm telling you, there's no place like Edmonton for hockey.
Yeah, I'd love to do listen, hockey's a great, very difficult sport to photograph because of the
Oh
ice.
no, it
It
is.
messes with your lens, it messes with the
That and
shutter speeds.
lacrosse
Yeah.
is almost impossible.
Yeah, I learned that when I tried to photograph my kid playing lacrosse for a season.
Yeah,
To
it's
figure out
hard.
which one was my kid.
Yeah,
So
everyone is blurry, right?
yeah. I had to look through. I'm like, what number were you? Where are you? But yeah, hockey's a tough one to photograph. You don't know where the action's going to be, but when you get
Football's
something,
kind
it's
of
special.
easy because if you know the game and the
Yeah.
play, you can position yourself where the guy's going to come off the field. Like, you can kind of figure it out and be there before he actually gets there.
Yeah, the problem are the referees. I've had a lot of
Yeah.
great photographs during my Michigan days. There's a real famous touchdown that Desmond Howard had when he won the Heisman Trophy against Notre Dame, where he dove for the ball. I have that photo perfect, except for the referee being right in front of it. And so you never know. Photography is a lot about luck and timing,
It is.
preparation, lighting, and they don't always turn out, but I take a lot of photos to try to capture as much as I can, and I love sharing them with people who want to see what a ballpark or a hockey arena is like if they haven't been there. So that's my passion, is sharing that. And like I said, these negatives don't do any good just sitting in boxes in storage getting dusty. So
Yeah.
I need to get them out to folks before they disintegrate.
Ken, thank you so much. I so appreciate I could talk to you all day.
Yeah. Same here. Same here. Thanks so much for having me. And then I just want to say it again. The website for the book is lastcomiskeybook.com. We're trying to avoid some of the big online sellers right now. So if folks visit lastcomiskeybook.com, all the details are there, including the event in Chicago. If anyone's nearby, it's a free event. And come see former Edmonton baseball minor leaguer Ron Kittle. Talk about the good old days. I'll have to ask him and mention that to him when
he
I
doesn't
see
know
him.
me, but he'll know.
I'll mention the Edmonton days.
Yeah.
So we'll have to talk about Tim Hortons together. So
Thank you
thanks so much for
much.
having me, Debbie. I really appreciate talking to you.
You're welcome.
This is Debbie Elicksen. Thank you to my guest and to you, the viewer, for watching this episode of Locker Room for Growth. Please subscribe to this channel and check out our past shows and clips in the YouTube playlist. The show broadcasts from Treaty 7 on Turtle Island, the traditional territory of the Blackfoot people, which includes Siksika, Blood, Piikani, Tsuut'ina, Stoney Nakoda Nations, and Métis Nation Region 3. Again, thank you for watching and please subscribe.